All right, and joining us now is Professor Salvatore Babones, Associate Professor at the University of Sydney and Executive Director at the Indian Century Roundtable. Professor Babones, usually we speak to you when you're on an India visit. Today we're talking to you when the Prime Minister is in your country. So first, let's start by hearing about your meeting with him. What did you speak of? What was it like?
We met for a full quarter hour, which I couldn't believe. It really took me by surprise. I had no idea he'd want to speak to me for quite so long, and mainly we talked statistics. And I have to say, as a social statistician, I don't expect to meet politicians and talk about national statistical infrastructures, but there you go. Mr. Modi was very curious as to what kind of statistics I use in my research, where I'm getting them, and what India could do to produce higher quality statistics to get its message out to the world. I emphasized to him that, India's image problem in the West is simply one that of not having accurate information out there about India. The India narrative, in the United States, Australia, the English-speaking world, is almost entirely driven by a few opinion writers with very little actual data being brought to the table. So he was thrilled to hear that message. It seems like he's a numbers man himself, which is someone after my own heart, and it was a very productive conversation. He actually promised that India would be working harder to produce the kinds of statistics the world needs to know India better.
Talking of image problem, that certainly didn't seem to be reflecting on the kind of responses we saw today, especially from the Australian Prime Minister when he said that the Prime Minister of India got a bigger reception than Bruce Springsteen. What do you make of that? For him to call Prime Minister Modi boss?
Well, look, that is true. That's not an exaggeration. And, Australian politicians are not used to getting stadium receptions. So to have a foreign politician get a stadium reception in your own country must feel like something of a boss move, Bruce Springsteen or otherwise. But on a more serious note, the Australian press covered the Prime Minister's visit in different ways. The Australian newspaper was mainly concerned with security cooperation, and it raised the issue of Russia, the Ukraine-Russia war, and India's position on Russia. The Sydney Morning Herald lead editorial about the visit mainly focused on their perceptions of human rights violations in India. Now, I myself had an op-ed in the Australian Financial Review in which I focused on the need for, as I put it, data, not drama, in our Western debates on India. And I actually handed that piece, that newspaper to Mr. Modi. People saw it in the photos. And, he seemed he actually didn't just seem very pleased. He told me he really loved that title. And it was one of the few times he broke into English saying, data, not drama. That's that's a great headline. And I said, yes, Mr. Modi, it's something I'm very proud of.
Do you think that India's perception, and more importantly, the perception of Prime Minister Modi, has changed at all in the eyes of the West, or that opinion is still divided?
Opinion is much less divided than it used to be. I mean, let's remember that back in 2014, when then Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott went to India and then invited Mr. Modi to come on a return visit to Australia. At the time, he was breaking ranks with Western leaders who were really uncertain as to whether or not they wanted to deal with Mr. Modi. And there was a big debate in the U.S. State Department over the protocol for Barack Obama, who was then U.S. president, to deal with Narendra Modi. Now, when Mr. Abbott invited Narendra Modi to Australia, and not only invited him to Australia, but invited him on a state visit to address a joint session of the Australian Parliament, that completely broke the ice on Western engagement with India. Everything fell away at that point. And that was the only other time Australia has had a big stadium politician event. That was 9 years ago when Mr. Modi visited Australia for the first time. So it really was Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, who in Western eyes, you might say, rehabilitated Narendra Modi. That is to say, swept the past, clean, said, well, there's been a proper investigation in the Indian judiciary of events in Gujarat in 2002. There's been a clean bill of health, and we should be welcoming the leader of the world's largest democracy with open arms. Once Tony Abbott did it, the rest of the West's leaders fell into line. Until today, there's absolutely no question, right? There's no question of Joe Biden inviting Narendra Modi on a state visit, potentially to address Congress. It's not even controversial anymore because everyone recognizes that, this is a highly respectable leader of the world's largest democracy.
So to what do you attribute this change of heart or a rethink or a relook, call it what you will? Is it a genuine look at what the reality is, or data, not drama? Or is it just looking out for their own country's self-interest?
Obviously, there's a little of both, but ultimately, I think there was a serious reassessment. I mean, when the U.S. State Department famously denied Narendra Modi a visa to the United States, he was an unknown outside India, an unknown state-level politician, and it simply it didn't receive attention at the highest levels in the United States. That is, there were a group of activists in the United States who vehemently wanted this visa denied. They lobbied for it. It was highly political. And then once the visa was denied, they spent the next 15 years talking about how Mr. Modi was denied a visa by the U.S. State Department. Now, that was a political victory, a highly politicized victory, won against a state-level politician. When it came time after 2009 to reevaluate the situation by the facts, to take a serious look at it, if there had been serious reservations in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, those reservations would still have operated. The difference is that in 2014, people took the responsibility seriously to look into the past, to make a decision. Is this someone we should or shouldn't be working with, in a way that they hadn't done earlier on because it just wasn't as big an issue earlier on. So yes, there's some degree of self-interest. Of course, everyone wants to be part of the India growth story, but also, there's a more careful look at Narendra Modi now than there was 15 years ago. And, the West is, to the credit of Western institutions, they are self-correcting. They do change their minds. We collectively change our minds when we have access to better information.
What is it principally in the personality or the politics of Narendra Modi, which over the last 9 years you think has changed in the eyes of the West?
Oh, everything has changed. 9 years ago, he was a wild card. Remember, even today, even in 2023, the recent poll showed that most Americans still cannot name the Prime Minister of India. Right. So there's a very low information environment in the West when it comes to India. And the result is that, even the smallest allegations can travel a long way. If you get one op-ed in a major newspaper, that can really change people's perceptions on the ground about India or about its prime minister. Now, Mr. Modi, over a course of 9 years, has established himself as, and I'm going to be serious here, the most respected political leader in the world today. And part of that is longevity. Part of that is never doing anything scandalous or, potentially reprehensible. I know there are many complaints about the BJP in India, as there should be in any democracy. There should be a very robust rough and tumble of political life. But let's face it, Mr. Modi has the kind of gravitas that it's hard to find anything really embarrassing in his past. Now, contrast that, say, to other leaders in the world stage today. Contrast that to Joe Biden. There are very serious questions that rise from, the Hunter Biden laptop issue or about his continuing mental faculties. These kind of questions don't arise with Narendra Modi. If we look at leaders in Japan, there's been a revolving door of leaders. So, although Fumio Kishida seems perfectly reputable, he's only been prime minister minister for a short time, and no one seems to be at the top for very long in Japan. Take the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson may have been many things to many people, but highly reputable is not something I've heard anyone call Boris Johnson. When you look around the world, it's hard to find any politician who has the kind of global respect that Narendra Modi has. The only one I can think who comes close is Angela Merkel, and she's now retired. I think he now has the field to himself.
Now, on the one hand, you've got a civil exchange, having a civil relationship, looking out for your country's self-interest, and then you have, a level of engagement where you've got Joe Biden saying, hey, your popularity is getting too much for me. The Premier of Papua New Guinea touching the Prime Minister's feet, to today what Anthony Albanese said. Are these things orchestrated? Because that is what is being said in India, that this is a massive stunt and event.
No. And Anthony Albanese wore a saffron tie to the event. I actually considered wearing a saffron tie to meet Mr. Modi, and I thought, no, that doesn't set the right tone. I want to be serious, and I wore a much more conservative, took a much more conservative approach. No, there's absolutely no coordination about this. This is all very genuine. Certainly, no one tells prime ministers what to do across countries. If when the prime minister in Papua New Guinea, I saw him make the gesture, and Mr. Modi stopped him, that would have been a very genuine gesture on his part. And in fact, India is just wildly popular in the Pacific Island countries because India is seen as a neutral partner. Now, a lot of Mr. Modi's popularity in the world comes from his innate respectability. But a lot of it is just down to the Indian people themselves. After all, why is Mr. Albanese so much in awe of Narendra Modi? Well, because Narendra Modi can get 20,000 Australians into a stadium for a rally. No Australian politician can get 20,000 Australians into a stadium for a rally. It just isn't done. The last stadium rally in Australia was 9 years ago for Narendra Modi. So I think the kind of the awe with which many Western politicians or many foreign politicians, including the Pacific Island states, view Mr. Modi is in part due to his longevity, in part due to his gravitas, and in part due, let's face it, to the success of India itself.
So when you have events of the kind that we had today in Sydney, where you had the Indian diaspora, 20,000 of them turn up, do you think this also has any kind of electoral significance? I ask this only because today also happens to be the day when exactly 4 years are completed of the Modi government. This is the day when in 2019 he was sworn in, or rather the election results came in on this day 4 years ago.
Look, knowing many members of the Indian diaspora in Australia, I wouldn't put it past them to have chosen the exact date for that reason. But of course, the date was driven by the original Quad Summit plans. And the Quad Summit plans were driven by the Quad Summit being immediately following the G7 summit. So really, it's impossible that, other than maybe changing things by 24 hours, it's impossible that the date for the rally could have been driven in any way by domestic political calculations in India. This really just is an artifact of the schedules that came together that were supposed to bring Joe Biden to Australia for a state visit. But of course, he pulled out of that visit and stayed in the United States. But no, this is not driven by Indian electoral calculations. If anything, the electoral calculations you should be looking at are the Australian electoral calculations. Indian Australians are seen as a population segment that is up for grabs. They don't have any traditional attachment to either of the two major political parties in Australia. The Chinese Australian community, which is the only comparable diaspora community, is overwhelmingly Labor voters, versus the Indian diaspora community seems to be roughly split between Labor and Liberal voters. Both parties are very eager to attract Indian voters, and Indian voters are concentrated in some of the most contentious, highly contended constituencies here in Australia. So if anything, it's a lot about Australian politics, not so much about Indian politics.
And finally, What do you make of the entire diaspora outreach that the Prime Minister does? Because this is a fairly new phenomenon.
Yeah.
Since the time the Prime Minister has come into power, Mr. Modi came into power in 2014, irrespective of which country he goes to, he makes it a point to meet the diaspora there. What do you think is the significance and importance of this? Because back home, it is sneered upon as a giant circus.
Let's be clear, there are two aspects to this that are reflected in the two hats worn by Mr. Modi. First, let's just be frank, Overseas Friends of the BJP is a large and growing organization. It's very active in the United States and Australia. I presume in other English-speaking countries, but I know in the US and Australia, they're very active chapters. I don't know how electoral financing works and if it's possible that they may contribute to the BJP. I'm not an expert on India's electoral financing laws. Certainly, they contribute expertise to the BJP that can be leveraged at election time. Whether or not there's financial benefits, there certainly would be human capital benefits to maintaining the Overseas Friends of the BJP. All that said, let's put that aside. Narendra Modi is not only the figurehead of the BJP, he is the Prime Minister of India. And the diaspora is crucially important for India's success in the world. We've seen this here, especially both in Australia and in the United States, with international investment, American and Australian investment into China being driven almost entirely by people in the Chinese diaspora who then go to work for major investment banks, who go to work for investment funds, and then help those investors navigate the intricacies of the Chinese system. Well, in the same way, the Indian diaspora is crucial for serving as an investment bridge between the West and India. And if Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, is reaching out to the diaspora, he's doing so because it's important for India. It really boosts India's overall foreign policy effort, its public diplomacy, but also its potential for inward investment and economic development. It's something that any Indian Prime Minister going forward will always be doing, no matter what party that person comes from.
Wonder if he'll get that kind of reception, though. Pleasure as always speaking to you, Professor Babones. Thank you very much for speaking to us on Times Now.